Professor Chomsky, thank you very much for taking the time to be with us.
Glad to be with you again.
So one of the main reasons you mentioned for Israel's war on Gaza has to do with Israel extricating itself from having to resolve the conflict peacefully ever since Hamas hinted that it's willing to join the international consensus of the two-state solution. Yet it seemed if you wanted to push Hamas into a position of rejectionism, that the initial bombing the first day of killing over a couple of hundred Palestinians and devastating the infrastructure would have been enough. What do you make of the scale of the continuation of the atrocities for 3 weeks?
Well, Hamas didn't hint at its willingness of a two-state solution. It has openly and repeatedly and publicly declared it, even in the U.S. press, op-eds by Ismail Haniyeh, in the British press and so on. So Israel knows perfectly well that Hamas has joined the international consensus for a two-state settlement. And the international consensus means on the international border, maybe some minor mutual modifications, other questions about refugees and so on. Well, Israel and the United States, it's the United States, remember, do not want that solution. In fact, for over 30 years, they've been blocking it in isolation. Actually, there's one exception in 30 years, 1 week in Taba in January 2001, end of Clinton's term, when the negotiators came pretty close to a solution in those terms. But Israel called off the negotiations prematurely, and that was the end of that. Occasionally you'll hear a hint of it, like when Prime Minister Omar resigned. He was forced to resign under corruption charges. He had an interview in the Israeli press in which he said, look, the only thing we can do is go back to that settlement. But it's never been policy. The policy, and this goes way back into the 1920s, is to try to defer political settlement as long as possible, meanwhile doing what's called building facts on the ground. So you construct the basis for some eventual political accommodation, which means expansion. Expansion is built in as an internal dynamic into the system, and the same with delaying negotiations. Even when there was an apparent agreement, like in 1947, it was with the understanding that it's a basis for going on to something more. And I can't run through the history right here, but it's a consistent history since 1967, backed by the United States. And now the United States and Israel are literally alone in their opposition to Palestinian national rights. And it's even explicit. In last December, at the United Nations meetings, there was a series of resolutions in which the U.S. voted alone almost against almost all of them. One of them was on the right of Palestinians to self-determination, not a state, just a right to self-determination. It was passed something like 175 to, I think, 5. The 5 were the United States, Israel, and a couple of the Marshall Islands or something like that. That's the usual lineup. So they're even officially opposed to the right of self-determination, just abstractly. And that makes sense if you want to continue expanding. And we don't have to, the expansion is clear in words, but it's perfectly obvious in deeds. That's what matters. Just look at what's happening on the West Bank. The so-called disengagement from Gaza was a fraud. Israeli hawks like Ariel Sharon, the patron of the settlers movement, understood perfectly well that it's absolutely senseless to keep a couple of thousand Jewish settlers in the ruins of Gaza, protected by a large part of the army and using up a substantial part of the land and resources. Make a lot more sense to transfer them over into the West Bank, which is valuable territory that Israel wants to keep. So they staged a national trauma, and it was staged in such a transparent way. It was even ridiculed by Israeli commentators. And you move them over to the West Bank and you subsidize them to develop the system that is emerging there. You can't miss it. Within the so-called separation wall, annexation wall, in fact, Israel will annex the arable land, the nice suburbs of Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, and the water resources. It's taken over the Jordan Valley. In fact, it's been doing it for years. That's about a third of the territory. That imprisons what's left. What's left is then cut into pieces by salients extending through Israeli towns, Ma'ale Adumim in the south, developed during the Clinton years to bisect the country, and 2 more up in the north through Ariel and Kadumim. And the rest of the territory is kind of segregated by hundreds of checkpoints, which are there mainly to make life impossible. Mm-hmm. Okay, actually goes way back to 67. Back in 1967, Moshe Dayan, who was head of the defense minister, was basically in control of the occupation, and incidentally pretty sympathetic to Palestinians, more so than most. His gave the analogy of, he said it's like a Bedouin who kidnaps a girl, and she doesn't want him, but he forces herself on him, and ultimately she'll accept him. He said that's the model. Mm-hmm. The Palestinians will live like dogs, is his phrase, and if they want to leave, they can leave, and that's fine. Now, in order to carry that program out, you have to delay a political settlement. That's an old tradition, back to the 1920s, and a sensible one. If you want to take away the land from people who don't want you there, it's hard to think of another approach. And it kind of resonates with American history. In fact, part of the support for Israel in the United States, popular support, is, well, what's our own history? Okay, we should know it, We weren't welcomed by the colonists, weren't exactly welcomed by the indigenous population. There were some collaborators, but, there always are. But, and now in the West Bank, Israel has, in fact, succeeded in crushing by force any resistance. Mm-hmm. Partly its own military force, partly settler violence, and now it has a collaborationist military force working for it. The Fatah forces that were trained and armed by the United States and its favored dictators. Okay, that's putting down demonstrations. It's pretty brutal. So they got the West Bank more or less under control. No resistance. They continue doing what they want. The United States funds it. Okay, don't worry about that. The U.S. gives diplomatic support, material support, and so on. In fact, well, I won't go into it. But in Gaza, they haven't quite crushed resistance. Now, Gaza was never free from occupation for a single day.
Yeah.
And also atrocities. Israeli army goes in when it wants. They got much worse after January 2006, mm-hmm. when Palestinians committed a heinous crime. They voted the wrong way in a free election. Now the master doesn't like that. He's supposed to follow orders, and if you don't, you get punished. It's part of the way the world works. So punishment, and it wasn't concealed. The U.S. and Israel instantly said, okay, we're going to punish the Palestinians for voting the wrong way. And the atrocities and crimes continued in both parts of Palestine, the West Bank and Gaza. And so it goes up to today. Well, the basic reason for the attack was just to ensure that Israel can carry out its West Bank takeover plans undisturbed. Now, there are other reasons. Narrow reasons. Like it's commonly pointed out, and correctly, that they have to what's called restore their credibility. Mm-hmm. That means make it clear to anyone that we can smash you into submission, so don't dare raise your head. That's called restoring credibility. Yeah. And then the timing of the election of the invasion probably had to do with the Israeli election. Yeah. In fact, one Israeli commentator pointed out at the beginning that for every 40 dead Palestinians, Barak gains 1 parliamentary seat.
So, to talk briefly about the Egyptian government's role in all of this, they made a decision that was a higher risk decision to incite popular hostility not only in Egypt but throughout the Arab world by collaborating with the blockade on Gaza and contributing to the humanitarian crisis. Do you think that's primarily a genuine desire on behalf of the Egyptian government to see Hamas defeated because it's an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, the main opposition, mm-hmm. or was it under intense Israeli-U.S. pressure?
I don't think they care much about Israeli pressure, but it was certainly under intense U.S. pressure. Mm-hmm. After all, Egypt is the second largest recipient of U.S. military aid after Israel, mm-hmm. and the dictatorship requires U.S. support. It's a brutal dictatorship. And yes, you're exactly right.